Was the implementation of collective farms in the Soviet Union successful? Well, let's find out. First, we must answer the question, what did Stalin at the time, what did he want? What was he trying to achieve? He had two primary goals. One, he wanted to increase the productivity of Soviet agriculture, and he wanted to use that gain uh, in grain, vegetables, and other products to sell it on the international market, and then use that money to develop the Soviet industry, primarily the war industry, because he knew there is a war coming, an imperialist war, and a brutal war, and he turned out to be right. He was, after all, attacked by Hitler. And reason number two, he wanted to establish control of the peasantry and of the Soviet economy. And of course, all totalitarian regimes seek to control their populations. So there was something nefarious about that goal. I do agree, but on the other hand, most historians agree that during the war it is useful for a state to have a tight grip on the economy. And later we'll analyze whether it was in fact useful. And I would agree with Isaac Deutscher in his assessment that it was useful. But let's also talk about the downsides of collectivization. The implementation of collective farms triggered a series of peasant rebellion across the Soviet Union, primarily in Ukraine and in Central Asia. The reason for that is that the process of implementing collective farms got combined with anti-religious campaign. By that I mean sending priests and imams to the gulags or to the Far East, the closure of churches and mosques, and the Muslim nomadic culture was disrespected during the process of establishing collective farms, because most Muslim tribes in the Soviet Union at the time and Muslim peoples like the Bashkirs or the tribes in Kyrgyzstan, they were nomadic, and they were forced by Stalin to live a stationary life on the farms, and they viewed that as disrespect, and it triggered the old animosities that existed between the separatist Muslim Basmachi movement and the Soviets. And what needs to be said, not many people know this, but while the Holodomor was happening in Kazakhstan, Stalin took the grain away from the people and killed somewhere around 1 million people just in Kazakhstan. He used that very brutal technique to crush the Muslim separatist movement. Separatist, and also some describe it a nationalist religious movement that wanted to secede from the Soviet Union, or at least have higher autonomy. And yeah, what needs to be said is that for Holodomor, some historians still argue that it was more of a combination of incompetence and indifference that led to mass hungers in Ukraine, but in Kazakhstan it was deliberate. Stalin just decided to kill a bunch of innocent people as well in order to kill the rebels that fled to the mountains. He took away their food, and the Muslim separatists they died of starvation. But let us return to our original question: was collectivization successful? Well, let's look at the data. So, was productivity increased? Well, after the initial failures that were the product of wars or peasant rebellions, however we call them, and also of the inefficient bureaucracy that was implementing the farms, and there was a drought and all these other factors led to a lack of productivity at first. But after 1933, there is a boost in productivity. And the reason is, well, collectivization forced those peasants that had metal tools to share it with those that didn't. I think it's obvious why that leads to increase in productivity. More peasants have metal tools, and the state also provided the peasants with tractors, with and uh, and they actually taught the peasants in many backwards regions of the Soviet state how to use tractors. For example, Maktauger talks about peasants in Kyrgyzstan that actually believed that the tractors were demons when they first saw them, and they attacked tractors with rocks. Which is, yeah, it sounds absurd, but that's how backward some parts of the Soviet Union were at the time, and collectivization actually provided those parts with equipment they needed and with proper education they needed. But Isaac Deutscher also reminds us that that same education was actually very useful in the mechanized war of destruction that happened on the Eastern Front. And let us not forget that without peasants being taught how to use tractors and more advanced agricultural tools, they wouldn't have been able to, let's say, use tanks at the Battle of Kursk or at the Battle of Moscow, or use other advanced machinery they needed to fight the Nazi war of annihilation that happened on the Eastern Front. And what Isaac Deutscher also argues is that the tight control of the grain and grain production during the war was actually useful, and it allowed the Soviet state to withdraw grain from many regions in time before the German army captured that grain. And that's how they saved their people from starvation, and they also harmed the German military that also lacked in food actually, and that in many areas of the Eastern Front actually lived from theft, lived by taking the food from the local population, which is how medieval armies often fed their people. And if we look collectivization through the prism of World War II or of preparation for that war, I would agree with Isaac Deutscher and well, even Robert Service, I believe, would agree that it was a successful process. But the main problem with collectivization becomes obvious actually after Hitler's war of annihilation that failed, that was crushed by the Red Army. In the peacetime, collectivization showed many of its flaws. For example, the general secretaries after Stalin continues to make collective farms bigger because they naively believe that bigger farms are better, that they produce more if they are bigger. But actually the opposite is the case. Robert Service argues that on smaller collectives, people will feel more pressure to work for their community because they know each other, because their failures can be more easily traced in a smaller community, and that's why social pressure will kick in, and they'll work more for their community, and that makes sense. But both Brezhnev and Khrushchev, for some reason, believe that making collective farms bigger will make them better, and the voices that warned them that isn't the case were silenced, because the freedom of speech did not exist in the Soviet Union, and they paid the price for that. For example, Voronov became scared of arguing against Brezhnev. He kept telling him to either make the farms smaller or to at least implement a system of kariks, as he called it, or smaller teams within larger farms. And also, the Soviet agriculture simply remained ignored in favor of other fields like the military or like producing factories in cities and ballistic technology. And that's why peasants simply weren't paid enough, and that also made them less productive. Not to mention that rural roads in the rural areas were in a very bad shape, and that also contributed to lack of productivity in rural areas. And that's why Soviet agriculture is called by many historians the Achilles heel of the Soviet Union. They lost millions and millions of potential grain that they could have produced had they developed their agriculture more. And yeah, in the period after the fall of communism under Yeltsin, decollectivization begins to happen in 1993. And at first, decollectivization does not lead to more productivity, because the process is combined with many other harmful processes, such as the spike in crime, the ruthless capitalism that's implemented under Yeltsin, just the chaos and the humiliation felt by millions of people in the Soviet Union after the fall of their empire. But under Putin, actually, there is a boost in productivity in the agricultural sector. From 1998 up until 2013, the Soviet agriculture or Russian agriculture productivity went up by 50% when compared to the Yeltsin period, which is one of the actually most impressive economic growth that happened in recent history. But there are many other reasons. For example, Putin also implemented a dose of economic protectionism that wasn't present under Yeltsin, and that also boosted the Soviet economy. That combined with international investments coming to the Russian economy, and with just more economic freedom. And that freedom allowed farmers, specifically in the southern regions of Russia, to specialize in meat production and growing vegetables. And that actually boosted the Russian economy significantly. So more freedom and more protectionism and more foreign investment, all of those factors contributed to that 50% growth that happened under Putin, as well as the oil prices growing. But yeah, currently the Russian economy isn't really doing very well, and the Russian reputation in the world is generally it went down after the start of the war in Ukraine, and yeah, I think that that early success that the Putin regime implemented will be overshadowed by the tragedy of the aggression, of the Russian aggression on Ukraine that's happening right now. But I'll do a separate video on the Russian economy and war in Ukraine. And yeah, it's definitely not good for the Russian Federation that their economy became more economically isolated, and that they have a lack of freedom similar to that under Brezhnev or Khrushchev. They are becoming, I won't say totalitarian, but definitely more authoritarian, um, like in the old days of Brezhnev. But yeah, so what's my take on collective farms? Well, most historians agree that at the time they were successful, and something like collectivization was needed in order for the Soviets to prevail against fascism. But after the war, the collectivization, or at least the way it was implemented by Brezhnev and Khrushchev, greatly harmed the Soviet economy. And that's all for today.